host, Richard RJ Eskow. Continuing our coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, my next guest is a journalist. Shir Hever's latest book is The Privatization of Israeli Security. He is a board member of a group called the Jewish Voice for a Just Peace in the Middle East, and he's the author of a recent article I found extremely interesting, originally in Middle East Eye and then in Common Dreams, was headlined, As Palestinians Unite, Israel is More Divided Than Ever, and he joins us now. So first of all, Shir Hever, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Secondly, I know that sometimes we journalists are given headlines we didn't write. So why don't we start here, if you don't mind? Do you agree with the bluntness of the statement in that headline that Palestinians are more united, but Israel is becoming more divided than ever?
Yes, usually when somebody writes an article, you have to trust the editor to give it a proper headline. But in this case, it was my headline that Middle East I accepted. So I'm very happy with it. Indeed, there is more division in Israeli society than ever before. And I don't think that we can talk about civil war, because this division doesn't necessarily mean that people are willing to act violently against each other or fight each other in the streets. But it does mean that Israelis are not willing to unite behind a common policy or a common sacrifice. While at the other side, Palestinians, whether inside the state of Israel or in the occupied West Bank or in the occupied and besieged Gaza Strip, are more unified than ever and are coordinating their resistance efforts and their protest.
You know, it was for me a striking observation, and perhaps for others as well, Shir, because it seems to me that certainly in the United States we have, or I shouldn't say everyone, many of us have the impression of a sort of unified, certainly Jewish Israeli society that has become much more aggressive over time, much more supportive of the settlements and the settlers on the West Bank, much less of a kind of what was once perceived as a liberal, kinder, gentler, strain in Israeli politics. So candidly, I was surprised to see that headline and fascinated by what you had to say about it. How visible do you think these fault lines are? Are people aware of this division? Are normal, everyday Israeli Jewish citizens aware that they're living with a state of division, you think?
Yes, absolutely. I think this image of a unified and aggressive and Israeli society, which is also racist, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, this is an image that is fueled by a lot of right-wing politicians that are talking the talk. But are they also walking the walk? That's the issue. When we talk with Israelis, when you have public opinion polls and you ask questions like, do you support the invasion of Gaza or the bombardment of Gaza by the Israeli military, you get very high numbers of support. Among the Jewish population, it's over 90%. But the next question, are you willing to do some reserve duty for the military, take up a gun, and actually go into Gaza and fight? Then you get completely different numbers. And in fact, although military draft is obligatory in Israel, 48% of young Israelis actually go to the military. That's less than 50%. This is, people find their way out, not necessarily out of political reasons, but they don't want to sacrifice their time, their lives, for a state which doesn't really represent them. You mentioned the fault lines. The fault lines go much deeper than just Jews and Palestinians. There are the ultra-Orthodox and the national Orthodox. There are the Ashkenazi Jews who originate from European countries like myself. There are Mizrahi Jews who originate from Arab or Muslim countries, which are about 50% of the Jewish population of Israel and have been discriminated against since the establishment of the state. So all of these fault lines are very deep, are very known to the public. And in fact, the exiting president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, who is now last few weeks of service has mentioned that Israel is a tribal society, and the different tribes are in constant conflict with each other, and tried to call for calm and appeasement between these tribes, but he didn't succeed.
You know, one of the fault lines that I think people, or many people, are aware of in this country is that between secular Jewish Israelis and the ultra Orthodox, as you call them, and who it seems from a distance, from a remove, have come to have enormous leverage in Israeli politics, so that, for example, because they are the one of the deciding blocks in political coalitions supporting Netanyahu or whomever, at any given moment, that they can demand certain changes based on religious law and, for that matter, support for settlements and others that may not be popular with other Israelis, but that other Israelis are powerless to stop. In a sense, in my mind anyway, there's a parallel with the gun lobby in the United States. Most people would like to see reasonable controls on gun sales, but this lobby is so powerful and so entrenched that there's no getting around it. It will get its way. And so in a sense, there is the perception that Israeli politics are sort of being held hostage by a far right and ultra Orthodox ideology. Is that true, you think?
I would certainly not put the far right and the ultra Orthodox in the same box.
Okay.
I think there is a very kind of simplistic view of the ultra Orthodox as one bloc, which is promoted by liberal groups within the Israeli political system as part of their desire to discriminate against ultra-Orthodox, to force them to serve in the military, and to cut off public budget to these groups. But of course, there's more than one ultra-Orthodox groups in Israel. A very significant number of them call themselves anti-Zionist, and therefore calling them far right would be very absurd, because they object to the idea of a secular Jewish state and do not support it. In fact, the largest party of the ultra-Orthodox, the head of that party refused to be a minister in the government. He said, I'll join the government, but I don't want to be a minister because I don't want people to say that I'm a minister in a state that calls itself a Jewish state. Eventually, he was forced by the Supreme Court to take the title of minister because effectively he was the minister of health, and now he's the minister of housing. But these groups have made a kind of alliance with the social democratic party, the Labour Party, which is in fact a very hardline militaristic party that established the first colonies in the West Bank and Gaza, the party that fought most of the wars that Israel was engaged in during the years. And the ultra-Orthodox had an agreement with them that they will be relieved of military duty and will receive some kind of support for the yeshivas, and in exchange they will support these right-wing politics of the Labour Party. This alliance is falling apart. This is what's now very interesting. In 2015, the coalition that was in power under Netanyahu wanted to force ultra-Orthodox to serve in the military. And then the ultra-Orthodox went on massive protests in the streets of Jerusalem and in other cities. They toppled the government. That was the reason that the government fell in 2015. A new government was formed with Netanyahu cleverly understanding that he has to shelve all of these ideas about forcing them to join the military and put them back in the government. But now there are more divisions, and there have been two very large disasters, catastrophes, one in the mountain of Meron for the Lag BaOmer festival, and another one in the illegal colony of near Pisgat Ze'ev, where a synagogue collapsed. And the reason for these two catastrophes, was that the engineers that were building these structures for the people to pray in were operating in some kind of autonomy. This autonomy that was created as a kind of pact for the ultra-Orthodox, so that they will have cultural autonomy. They will not follow the same regulations and rules as the rest of the country, which it only contributes to more stereotypes against them. In the end, people died, and all of the people who died were ultra-Orthodox themselves. It's not that they did anybody else harm, but this idea that they would have their own autonomy doesn't really work with a kind of modern state. It certainly did not work with the COVID-19 crisis, where they refused to follow the same kind of regulations. Not only them, a lot of groups within Israel refused to follow the regulations. And that really put a strain on this idea that they could have an autonomy and their own self-administration.
So let's try to unpack this for a little, please. And again, we're talking with Shir Hever, who is a journalist about the divisions in Israeli society. I am interested in these ultra-Orthodox groups. We've heard something about them in this country that basically don't support the concept of a Jewish state. Number one, my understanding, which could very well be wrong, Shir, is that is theologically based because of the historical belief that the traditional belief that the Jewish state will come into existence when the Messiah comes. And the Messiah has not come, therefore the preconditions for a Jewish state have not been met, therefore you're kind of out of, you're violating religious law by proclaiming a Jewish state prematurely. Is that essentially an accurate...
Yeah, there is a clause in the Talmud which clearly says that until the Messiah comes, it is forbidden for Jews to emigrate in large numbers to the Promised Land. It's as simple as that. And then there was a very large group of people who broke off from the ultra-Orthodox and formed what we call the National Orthodox movement. And these are the people that you often see in the news as the so-called settlers or colonists in the West Bank because they wear a kippah, but they don't wear the full black suit. And the National Orthodox have a different theology in which they say the Messiah is perhaps not a person, the Messiah is perhaps a movement, and we are the movement. And that justifies taking over the Holy Land, and that turns it into a holy war. But the ultra-Orthodox rabbis reject that theology wholeheartedly and say this is a perversion of our faith.
I was talking with a friend of mine about this the other day, and I articulated what I think is an incorrect belief, which was my sense was that, because I think I'm projecting, what I see in Orthodox communities in the U.S., I thought that the ultra-Orthodox who reject the concept of a Jewish state were a small minority of the Orthodox in Israel. But I'm getting the sense from you that they're not, that they're a significant group.
Well, the numbers differ a little bit by how you judge it, and you have some people that define themselves as ultra-Orthodox but are less stringent and so on. But we're talking about a maximum 15% of the population of Israeli citizens. But I think it's very important for me to say at this point that we should not be dragged into a discussion, as much as a theological discussion is fascinating for me, but we should not fall into the misconception as if this is a religious conflict. It's not a war between Judaism and Islam. This is a conflict about territory, about domination and control, and the Palestinians are demanding equality and freedom within the territory where they live and have lived for centuries. And the situation is a situation of apartheid. And apartheid means a very deep injustice based on ethnic identity, not based on religion. It doesn't matter if a Palestinian decides to believe in the Jewish faith, the Jewish Palestinian. They could be as stringent as they want, they're not going to get any rights. And in the same way, a Jew who decides not to believe in God, and many decide like that, do not lose their rights. So it is not about religion. But this apartheid situation creates divisions not just between two groups. Also, the apartheid system that existed in South Africa or in Rhodesia or in other countries was a system that created also deep inequalities within each of the groups. Mm-hmm. So it creates a very complex hierarchy. And that's why the Israeli society is so divided. The ultra-Orthodox is one group which is fighting for its own rights and autonomies within the system. But if you have apartheid, you have no rights for anyone. There is no concept of rights, which are self-evident and every human being can call them. All you have is privileges. And some groups have more privileges than the other. This is how apartheid works. And this is also the way that apartheid falls apart.
In a sense, what I think you're saying is that the social psychology of apartheid is not only an engine of oppression for the direct victims of apartheid, but that it results in other variants of oppression. When you start seeing the world through that lens of apartheid, and I'm running with what you said, so you feel free to disagree, but that when you start seeing the world through that apartheid lens, that some people have no value in your system versus others, or lesser value, or whatever, then no rights or lesser rights, then pretty soon that psychology starts to impose itself on fellow members of your own community, that you may think of them as somehow less than yourself. I'm old enough to remember the controversy in Israel over the so-called falasha, or black Jews as they were called, being treated terribly, and that I think part of what you're saying is that the divisions in Israeli society, in some sense, are exacerbated by and are reflecting this psychology of apartheid. Am I on a tangent?
No, that's absolutely correct. And black Jews are still not equal in Israel, and do not have the same rights that white Jews have. Just 2 years ago, there were mass demonstrations against police violence and police killings of protesters, which were very similar to what we saw in the United States. And it's very interesting that black Jews have adopted the language, the terminology, the slogans for their demonstrations from other groups, and said, just like Palestinians are being oppressed, we also feel oppressed. Just like labor immigrants have no right and are being treated terribly and are being deported in large numbers, we also don't like it when the police comes into our neighborhood and starts beating people up and making arbitrary arrests. And this is exactly what happens. You have an apartheid system that is supposed to be binary, but it never works that way. And what we saw now in the last couple of weeks with the outbreak of violence all over Israel, Palestine, we saw that journalists, politicians who normally talk about equality and peace and so on, they just shut their mouth. They were afraid. Many journalists had to have security guards at their homes because they received death threats. Because if you say something like, maybe we should not kill everybody in Gaza, but make sure that we don't hurt innocent bystanders and unarmed civilians, then you are branded as an Arab lover, as a traitor, and you face serious threats. So then you have this very strong oppression within Israeli society and silencing of dissenting voices. And of course, in such conditions, nobody is really free.
And I did want to talk about that a little bit before we get back to the divisions. And again, we're talking to the journalist Shir. One of the other reasons I think why Americans sometimes tend, even interested Americans who care and read up on it, sometimes think that Israeli society is more unified than it is because we hear these stories about these peace activists or people who merely want to recharacterize what you said, maybe drop off slightly fewer bombs or what have you, that these people have to get police guards, they have to, go into hiding, et cetera, and somehow, at least I came away with the impression, well, everybody hates them. They are despised by the entirety of Israeli society, except that handful of people who believe the way they believe. But now I'm not so sure that's true. It may be that there are sympathizers, many sympathizers, but those who oppose them are maybe 10% of the population sympathizes with them, but those who oppose them are so vehement and extreme that they are still in danger. Where do those people fit in society?
I think these two things, where you are a pro-occupation, pro-war, right-wing Israeli and an anti-occupation, anti-war Israeli, they exist simultaneously within the same person. That's how apartheid works, or that's how colonialism works, really. And in South Africa, during the last days of apartheid, up to the very end, more than 90% of the white population of South Africa said that they supported the apartheid system. But as soon as apartheid collapsed, they all said, oh, we were always against it. And they were not lying. It's because if you live in this kind of society, you have to have a kind of split in your own consciousness. You have to believe opposite things at the same time. I think a lot of Israelis, they speak out of anger, but then if you talk to them and say, wait, do you really think that Palestinians are not human beings and should all be killed? And don't you think that this could cause trouble with the International Criminal Court? And isn't that a bit similar to fascism or to anti-Semitism and other forms of racism that you're proposing? Then they would say, no, I'm not a racist. And I don't think Palestinians should be killed, but I just don't know if I can trust them. It would be nice if there could be peace. After the political solution will come, after the political change comes, and there will be democracy and equality, I'm certain that the same Israelis that are now rattling their sabers and calling for more bombs on Gaza would say, we always wanted peace, we have nothing against Palestinians, but they will only start to say that when they don't have to religiously guard their privileges, and when they're not afraid of a very large population of Palestinians who are angry and demand equality. After the equality is achieved, then you can hear what people really think.
I also find sometimes that when people hold a position out of self-interest or conformity or all the reasons people have for believing certain things, and someone confronts them about it, however peacefully, that sometimes that can make people extremely angry. That because, and I think, the anger may be directed at someone like you or me, but really it's an anger within themselves. It's their own conscience arguing with their brain, if you will. Is that, you think, part of what goes on in Israeli society right now?
There's a very interesting debate happening now in the Israeli media about the kind of pictures that the Israeli military itself uses to justify the bombings in Gaza. And some Israelis, a lot of Israelis are putting on social media also these kind of pictures where you see the Israeli military destroying a civilian house, a civilian building with dozens of apartments, or the building Al Jala, which was a media center of several important media organizations, international media organizations, that was bombed by the Israeli military. And the Israeli military is itself promoting these pictures. And then some people say, when they see the picture, they feel more strongly identifying with the Israeli side, maybe because this is how the anger works, because they are already, their mind is already feeling confronted by criticism against this kind of destruction. But of course, then Israelis are always surprised when the pictures are distributed in international media and are being used to criticize Israeli attacks. And even the American government, which is usually blindly supporting the Israeli bombardments of Gaza. So Blinken said he wants to see some evidence. Why did Israel blow up the Al Jalal building? What kind of evidence do they have that the Hamas party had any kind of military facilities there? Of course, the Israelis don't have any evidence for that because they never looked for any evidence. But this is something that it's very difficult for Israelis to understand, that the same picture evokes a completely opposite response when seen from the outside.
And you write, it's fascinating to me, and Shir, Hever, you write that this, not only about the divisions in Israeli society, but that these last round of bombings have made it worse. And of course, you and I know that this escalation was precipitated in part by the evictions in East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, by the invasion of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and by Israeli authorities and so on. But having talked now a little bit about the divisions themselves, in what way do you think this last course of events, which I would say culminates with these bombings, they were not the beginning of it, have exacerbated these divisions in Israel?
Let me say something quick about Sheikh Jarrah, because I I think it's not a coincidence that it started there. It's not just one of those places where the ethnic cleansing is so brutal and aggressive, but also one of the most controversial from the internal Israeli debate point of view. Because a lot of Zionist Israelis, even right-wing Zionist Israelis, say maybe Sheikh Jarrah is not the place that we should put all of our efforts on. Let's work in other places, because there, the argument that has been presented to the Israeli court is that Jews used to own those buildings before the 48 war, and now they demand to receive their property back that they lost in the 48 war. But of course, they say, what kind of precedent will that create if millions of Palestinian refugees ask for their property that was lost in Israel after the 48 war or during the 48 war? And so let's leave that Pandora box closed. I think that is also the reason that Netanyahu chose Sheikh Jarrah as the spark to light this particular explosion, because he knew it's a very divisive issue, both within Israel and, of course, between Israelis and Palestinians. And that created the crisis that he needed for that moment. The reason that I think this particular crisis is very depressing, I have to say, from my point of view, because I belong to several organizations. You mentioned the Jewish Voice for a Just Peace in the Middle East, that hope to see people living together in a democracy or in two democracies. It doesn't matter if it's one state or two states, but it matters that people will be able to live and have full rights, both Jews and Palestinians, in this country, which is called Israel and is called Palestine at the same time. But what we see with this particular round of violence is that a lot of Palestinians who have been fighting for equal rights using civil means, using civil resistance and protests and calling for boycott of Israeli products, nonviolent protests, they have been marginalized. And the Palestinians who have the rockets, the Hamas party, the Islamic Jihad, that they have weapons, they claim the victory. They say, look, we were able to achieve with rockets more than what you can achieve with signs and demonstrations. And that is very depressing, because I've been talking so far a lot about the South Africa example, also because I would like to see a kind of South Africa solution, democracy and equal rights. Flawed, sure, South Africa is not the most stable country in the world, but it's certainly better than it was under apartheid. But there are other models. There is the model of Algeria. In Algeria, the armed groups were able to drive off the French colonial population and the military. But the cost that they had to pay to win that war against the vastly superior French military was the destruction of their own society. And Algeria, until today, did not become a democracy. It's still deeply divided, because the culture of militarism that was needed to defeat the French has also seeped into Algerian society and caused a lot of problems there. And I think if the Palestinians win, they will win eventually. There's no question. They will win. But the question is, how will they win? Will they win through nonviolent methods, public protest, a grassroots movement, and create a democracy? Or will they win through force of arms and create some kind of dictatorship, which would be bad both for Jews and for Palestinians?
And Shir, we have the same goal. And I was one of those. I'm embarrassed at my own naivete. But I was one of those who used to say years ago, well, the Palestinian resistance would be more effective if it dedicated itself to nonviolent protest. But we've seen years now of nonviolent protest at the border fence, for example, being met with brutal killing, with just the shooting and killing of protesters, the shelling of beaches where children are walking, whatever have you. So it's very, very hard for me to continue to make the case for nonviolent action, whether it's through the courts, whether it's through political activity, whether it's through nonviolent protests, when that's being met with slaughter. And I can only imagine how, and which includes the ongoing structural violence of deprivation and poverty. And so I can only imagine how that's being processed in Palestine. And one of the things that you and others have mentioned, which to me is intriguing but also worrisome, is, for the reasons you described, is the fact that, all the architecture designed to divide the Palestinians seems to be failing now. That my guess, correct me if I'm wrong, my guess is that if elections were allowed across Palestine, Hamas would win. That there is increasing support for, we did an interview last week with someone on the ground in Gaza who was saying, despite all the death and pain, that he's hearing more and more people supporting when the Hamas rockets go up, even though they know disaster will come in return. That's a frightening escalation. And I'm not sure, short of a radical transformation of Israeli Jewish public consciousness, a way to reverse that.
No, the Israeli public consciousness is not going to change before the political change. They will change very dramatically after. We don't get to choose, however, for the Palestinians how they want to resist. And we don't get to say to the Palestinians, if you ask us to support the boycott movement, the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, we're not going to do it because Israelis are going to punish you and kill you. So out of a kind of patronizing care for your lives, we're going to refuse your request. That is not something that we from outside of Palestine get to say. But of course, the Palestinians have to choose for themselves. I don't know if elections would happen today, who will win. What I hear from my friends and colleagues on the ground is that there's a deep dissatisfaction both with the Fatah party and with the Hamas party. Because Fatah have said, we're going to go the road of diplomacy, and the international community will support us. The international community did not support. Hamas says, we're going to go the path of war, and we will eventually defeat the Israeli military, but still the Israeli military is far stronger than Hamas. So most Palestinians that I've been talking to said, we need a third option. And maybe the third option is to just do away with any kind of separate Palestinian political entity, the Palestinian Authority, and instead demand to have equal rights in one entity in which all people who live in that country will be equally represented. So that's, I think, also a direction we're going into, and maybe that's a better one. But of course, the reason that the BDS movement is very successful in the sense that it has entered the consciousness of Israelis. Every Israeli knows what BDS is. They are aware that through BDS, they have a reputation of colonialist apartheid regime. When they leave Israel, when artists consider coming to give concerts in Israel, this is a debate that always rises up again and again. In that sense, BDS has been successful. The problem is, we have been saying, BDS activists have been saying to politicians for years, if you oppose BDS so violently as many politicians in the United States, trying to legislate against it, I'm speaking from Germany, where the parliament actually did pass a resolution condemning BDS and comparing it with anti-Semitism. Those kinds of attempts to censor BDS and to repress it, they really play into the hands of the Hamas party. Then the Hamas party says, look, the world is against us. We are all alone. And that's how they can unify the Palestinian public around them and go the path of violence. I think it's my duty because, my family still lives in Israel. I have friends and family there. I care for them. And I think I have a duty to offer Palestinians another way, to prove to Palestinians that the world did not abandon their struggle. They're not alone, and that they have a way to achieve their rights without using rockets.
Which, in a sense, is also what happened in South Africa in the end. I guess my last topic or question for you, Shir Hever, is this. Sometimes there are heated conversations about Israel and Palestine in the United States. As you can imagine, we are the number one sponsor of the Israeli government. Someone like me who has a Jewish family, I don't need to elaborate, but one of the things that, sometimes comes up as well, Richard, do you mean to say that you no longer support Israel as a Jewish state, and you now have abandoned the two-state solution and going for one state where Israelis and Palestinians live together? My answer to that is always, it doesn't matter what Richard thinks at this point. That ship has sailed. That Israel itself, by allowing 400,000 plus people to settle in the West Bank and by some other actions, has declared its support for one state, except it wants it to be a Jewish state. So I think the question now is just, what will the new state of the future look like? I get a lot of flack for that, but that's my perception. And do you think I'm wrong?
I think that you're wrong when you say that ship has sailed. First of all, you mentioned 400,000. Actually, it's 600,000 colonists in the illegal colonies in the West Bank, so even more. But that still doesn't mean that two states is not possible. I think that it's true that there is a very strong tendency among Europeans, North Americans mostly, to think that they can dictate to the people who live in Israel, Palestine, what kind of future they should have. And of course, that never sounds quite right. It reminds people of when Europeans did actually divide this territory into countries just based on arbitrary decisions of colonial governors. But the people on the ground are divided also on this question, and their opinion counts very much. And the Israelis have already decided not to decide. They've decided that there's not going to be any willingness to make any kind of compromise or to reach a solution. Apartheid is the status quo, and they want the status quo to continue, and Israeli control over the entire territory. But Palestinians haven't decided yet. And that's what makes it very interesting. I think in different opinion polls, you get very different results. There is a clear tendency where more and more Palestinians choose the one democratic state. And this movement demanding one state for everyone, of course, there's a lot of questions. What kind of state is that going to be? What will be the role of religion within that state? But as soon as you say that ship has sailed, or the two-state solution is dead, you are depriving Palestinians from their right to choose. I personally would like to see one democracy from the river to the sea where everyone have equal rights. And of course, this kind of country cannot call itself a Jewish state or a Muslim state or any other kind of state belonging only to one group. It will have to be a state for all its citizens, like any democracy on the planet. But this is what I prefer. This is what many of my friends and colleagues prefer. But it can only be a preference if there's another option. And if we start to adopt this kind of language that says, we have to pursue this because there's no other choice, then this is a very defeatist way of talking about it. And it really plays into the hand of the Israeli government, who says, look, we have killed the two-state solution. Now let's push a bit more and kill the idea of a democratic state and just have the status quo we want forever. So no, we should not agree with them.
Okay, well, I appreciate the admonition on that, and I encourage people to read your article, As Palestinians Unite, Israel is More Divided Than Ever. And again, my guest has been Shir Hever. Shir is a board member of Jewish Voice for Just Peace in the Middle East, and his latest book is The Privatization of Israeli Security. Shir, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we'll be back right after this. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.